3,000 votive offerings. That was the annual cost of purity inside Persepolis. Not in gold, not in grain, but in girls. Royal daughters, catalogued like sacred assets, perfumed like temple offerings, summoned in silence. This wasn't holiness, it was accounting. So who paid for the empire's divine order? And who profited from turning innocence into ritual? The chronicles fall silent. The clay ledgers and bones do not. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Persepolis gleamed like an earthly heaven. Sunlight struck marble lions that guarded the gates, and foreign envoys called it the City of Light. But inside the women's quarters, that light dimmed. No marble reflected what happened there. Xerxes, newly crowned King of Kings, inherited an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, a machine built on administration, taxation, and faith. Yet his truest experiment began not on battlefields, but behind the palace doors. The doctrine of divine blood was ancient. The royal line descended from Ahura Mazda, god of light and order. To touch that bloodline was to touch the divine. It justified obedience. It explained conquest. It sanctified hierarchy. But under Xerxes, the doctrine turned inward. Purity no longer protected the daughters. It consumed them. He declared that no man outside the royal bloodline could approach what was sacred, and so the circle of sanctity closed around his own house. Inside it, he was not merely a father. He was the god of flesh, the judge of hurity, and the law itself. It began with paper, or rather, clay. Royal scribes catalogued every woman in the palace, name, age, origin, and bloodline. Eunuchs managed rotations. Physicians logged the girl's health in coded language, anointed, rested, presented. The language of devotion disguised the logistics of domination. To the treasury, they were entries. To the priests, vessels. To Xerxes, proof that divinity could be measured in obedience. The Magi, the priestly caste, gave these acts moral geometry. The king purifies what he touches, they wrote. Through union, light renews itself. It was theology designed to anesthetize conscience. The court poets followed suit, writing hymns where the daughters appeared as stars circling the sun, metaphors that made subjugation sound like grace. For the women of the palace, silence was not commanded. It was engineered. The corridors themselves enforced it. When a eunuch approached, no one looked up. When a girl was summoned, her mother washed her in rosewater, brushed her hair, and whispered the words that kept them alive. Do not resist. Do not speak. Resistance was not punished. It was erased. Each ritual followed the same choreography: the bath, the perfume, the linen, the prayer. The same steps that once sanctified the gods now sanctified a man. Even the lamps were trimmed to burn evenly, so the light would not flicker on the king's shadow. To the attendants, routine became morality. To the victims, survival required disappearance. Outside those walls, Persia prospered. Roads were paved, temples funded, armies fed. The empire was efficient because its cruelty was efficient. The same administrative logic that taxed farmers also scheduled the king's rituals. The same seal that authorized trade routes sealed orders to prepare his daughters. That is the paradox this story exposes. The more perfectly a state runs, the easier it becomes to hide its cries. Xerxes didn't need secrecy. He needed participation. The priests sanctified, the eunuchs enforced, the physicians repaired, the scribes omitted. Together, they created the illusion of order, and that illusion was more powerful than fear itself. One night, during the Festival of Renewal, the palace drums sounded after midnight, a rhythm reserved for the king's private rites. A 12-year-old girl, Artune, was chosen. Her attendants wrapped her in linen, placed golden bangles on her wrists, and perfumed her hair with myrrh. Outside, the court chanted hymns to Ahura Mazda. Inside, her mother wept silently behind a curtain. The eunuch appeared, expressionless. He read from a wax tablet, confirming her name, her lineage, her readiness. And then he said the word every mother feared most: summoned. She walked barefoot across the marble hall. Each step echoed in a silence too complete to be natural. When the golden doors closed behind her, the empire's theology became flesh. That moment, a girl crossing a threshold, contained the entire logic of power, that the body could be both sacred and expendable, both worshipped and destroyed, without contradiction. So we must ask, how did a civilization that built roads, libraries, and law codes come to believe that domination was divine? How did bureaucracy replace morality? And what happens to an empire when its ruler confuses faith with ownership? That is the big question that will guide this story. And the answer does not lie in myth, but in record. In the administrative tablets unearthed from Pipilus, where the same handwriting that listed grain rations also logged the perfumes of the royal women. What began as a family secret became a state doctrine. Xerxes turned the royal household into an institution, complete with ranks, ledgers, and standardized rituals. In his world, intimacy became procedure. Every daughter's chamber was catalogued. Every ritual had an assigned hour. Eunuchs filed reports, priests submitted written blessings, and treasurers recorded expenses for perfumes, oils, and silks. Budget lines indistinguishable from army rations or temple repairs. That is how tyranny survives refinement, not through rage, but through administration. The same empire that perfected irrigation and postal systems now perfected obedience. Inside Persepolis, cruelty was no longer an act of passion. It was workflow. For the palace staff, the king's purification rites were as routine as tax collection. At dawn, attendants prepared linen garments and ritual oils. Midday, eunuchs rehearsed their duties in silence. By nightfall, the lamps were trimmed, the incense burned, and the chosen name was whispered down the corridor like a state order. One servant carried the bathwater, another carried the incense. A scribe waited outside to mark completion. Attended. That single word covered everything, from grooming to violation. Every act was written down except the truth. It didn't need to be. In an efficient empire, omission is the highest form of loyalty. Through these layers of record keeping, Persia achieved something astonishing. It industrialized sanctity. Even pain had paperwork. The Magi, the priests of Ahura Mazda, faced a crisis. How could they justify what everyone knew was happening? Their survival depended on redefining morality itself. They composed new hymns declaring that the king's will was a reflection of divine fire. If Xerxes desired something, it was destiny. If he broke something, it was purification. And so divinity became circular logic. Because the king is divine, what he does is holy. Because it is holy, it cannot be questioned. Because it cannot be questioned, it must be divine. This was not faith. It was theology as insulation, a priesthood rewriting scripture to survive its own cowardice. They even invented a phrase that appears on later tablets, Dhyana Yazata, the purification of divine essence. Every ritual in the women's quarters was framed as a contribution to cosmic balance. The abuse was relabeled as maintenance of the universe. No empire endures by force alone. Fear breaks bodies. Belief binds souls. Xerxes understood this intuitively. He didn't need to convince his victims that he was right. He only needed to convince everyone else that he couldn't be wrong. For the daughters, silence became instinct. They learned to smile on command, to speak in rehearsed phrases of devotion. A girl who cried risked exile. A mother who hesitated risked disappearance. Over time, the victims themselves began repeating the empire's logic. This is destiny. This is purity. This is the order of the world. It was not delusion. It was adaptation. When survival requires belief, disbelief becomes a kind of suicide. The servants, too, adjusted. They convinced themselves that obedience was virtue, that their hands merely served the flame. They didn't light the fire, they only carried the lamp. And so the system thrived, thousands participating in a crime none dared to name. Systems never stay contained. When the theology of purity stabilized inside the court, it spread outward, like a contagion masked as culture. Nobles began marrying cousins to keep the blood pure. Governors referred to themselves as guardians of sacred lineage. Even merchants used the phrase untainted goods as a sign of moral prestige. Persia's administrative perfection became its moral corrosion. By turning sanctity into a political resource, Xerxes taught every official how to hide cruelty behind piety. Temples multiplied, rituals expanded. But beneath the incense and prayer, everyone copied the same logic. Power justifies itself. When Xerxes led his armies westward against Greece, he didn't leave the system behind, he brought it with him. The royal wagons followed the troops, sealed and guarded, carrying several of his daughters and their attendants. The official inscriptions called it the procession of divine presence. In reality, it was a moving shrine of fear. Commanders who built bridges or achieved victories were rewarded not with gold, but with royal favor. The phrase appears in the military tablets like a mark of distinction, but everyone knew what it meant. Contact with the royal daughters was the new currency of loyalty. A man blessed by the king's household would never betray him. Desire became diplomacy. On the battlefield, this logic metastasized. Soldiers killed in Xerxes' name were told they were purifying the world. Priests sprinkled water on weapons before battle, calling them extensions of divine will. The empire marched under banners of sanctity, convinced that slaughter was service. The farther Persia expanded, the more hollow it became. Each ritual, each war, each decree served one purpose: to prove the king's purity. But proof is a hunger that never ends. Within the palace, repetition replaced reason. The daughters no longer had names, only titles. Beloved of light, chosen vessel, completed one. The priests no longer had faith, only survival. The officials no longer had conscience, only procedure. Every empire tells itself it is eternal. Persia told itself it was sacred. But sacredness without morality is just bureaucracy worshipping itself. By the third year of Xerxes' reign, the machinery ran without friction. No one needed to command cruelty anymore. It was automatic. The eunuchs opened doors, the priests blessed, the scribes recorded, the victims obeyed. Silence was not the absence of rebellion. It was the proof that rebellion had become unthinkable. Yet, in that silence, something began to shift. Whispers among servants. Priests who drank too much after prayers. A general who looked at the king and saw not divinity, but madness. The empire's perfection had reached its limit, and perfection, once achieved, always begins to crack. By the 7th year of Xerxes' reign, the silence that once held Persia together began to rot it from within. The palace no longer whispered devotion, it whispered exhaustion. Priests repeated hymns without faith. Generals avoided the king's eyes. The daughters, once symbols of purity, moved through marble corridors like living ghosts. When Xerxes returned from his failed Greek campaign, the illusion of divinity shattered. The empire that had worshipped him as light now feared him as shadow. And to reclaim his godhood, he turned inward, against his own blood. The Magi tried to disguise the collapse. They preached that defeat was divine trial, that pain renewed purity. But no one believed them, not even the Magi. Their faith had become choreography. Inside the palace, fear no longer produced order, it produced madness. Xerxes demanded longer prayers, harsher obedience. His daughters were summoned nightly. Physicians described divine agitation, meaning rage. A eunuch who hesitated disappeared. A nurse who showed compassion was exiled. The rituals continued, but they no longer sanctified. They consumed. The empire kept its structure, but lost its soul. In 465 BCE, the inevitable happened. Xerxes was murdered in his sleep by Artabanes, his own general, once a loyal servant, once a man rewarded with royal favor. The chronicles call it ambition, but perhaps it was something simpler: exhaustion. The moment when even obedience could no longer carry the weight of sanctified cruelty. When priests performed his final rite, they called it union with light. But the fire burned low. No god answered. The air smelled not of incense, but of smoke and fatigue. His son, Artaxerxes, inherited everything but conviction. He preserved the rituals, the scribes, the temples, but only as reflex. The empire continued to function, but like a body moving after death. No one dared to stop the machinery, yet no one believed in its purpose. Within a century, Persia collapsed under its own perfection. When Alexander's armies arrived, they didn't conquer a people of faith, only a bureaucracy of silence. The empire that called itself eternal had already forgotten why it existed. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered what history tried to erase: sealed chambers, incense jars, and tablets listing perfumes for royal women. Amid the records, one fragment stood apart, crudely scratched by an untrained hand. I am still here. 3 words trembling across millennia. 3 words that answer the big question. They show how cruelty becomes sacred through repetition, ritual, and schlitz, and how it dies through remembrance. Xerxes believed divine order required silence, yet it was silence that destroyed him. Because no empire, no god, no ruler can remain holy once its victims are remembered. The ruins of Persepolis still stand, columns gleaming, inscriptions proud, but beneath them lie the bones that kept the illusion alive. Every tablet, every fragment, every faint human mark is proof that power is never divine, only temporary, and always paid for in flesh. So when we gaze at the ruins, we should not see glory, we should see the cost. Because the machinery of divinity never truly dies, it adapts. It lives in every government that calls cruelty order, in every silence mistaken for peace. And when that silence finally breaks, the bones will speak again. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.